session will focus on a handful of our legislative priorities in support of renters. Their needs are especially acute during the current public health crisis. The Torah obligates us to preserve our own life and health and that of others. We are taught that all people should have de maksuro, resources sufficient for each one's needs. Eviction was a serious problem prior to the COVID pandemic. Now it's an even greater threat. About 350,000 households in Maryland are at risk. Eviction is more than loss of a home. People often lose their possessions, struggle to find new housing, may lose jobs, community, and social supports. Children often have to change schools and fall behind educationally, lose friends. The economic, social, and psychological trauma can cause a downward spiral that scars people for life.
Our speakers have been working closely with those who are most impacted by housing challenges while advocating for legislation that would reform the judicial process to help tenants have safe and stable housing. We will now introduce them and briefly tell you about their work. You can find their complete bios on the Heschel app.
Zephyr Shah is currently an attorney with the Human Right to Housing Project within the Public Justice Center. He directs client services, high-impact litigation strategies, community partnerships, and legislative advocacy, all for a single focus on the empowerment of politically and socially marginalized communities. In addition, Zephyr serves on several working groups and caucuses, co-leads the Renters United of Maryland Coalition with JOFJ. Notably, he recently has been invited to testify before special committees of the Maryland Senate and to serve on Maryland's Attorney General COVID-19 Access to Justice Task Force, specifically in the group concerned with keeping Marylanders housed.
Tisha Guthrie is an activist for renters' rights in Baltimore. She earned a bachelor's of philosophy from Morgan State and a master's of social work from the University of Maryland, Baltimore. In 2018, she was appointed as a commissioner to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. Tisha is currently the chairperson of the Bolton House Residents Association, is a member of the Baltimore Renters United Steering Committee, and has served as the treasurer of the Bolton House Residents Association. As a housing choice voucher participant, she brings her personal experience and that of her neighbors to her advocacy work and is often called upon as a spokesperson by the media. We are so honored to work with Zephyr and Tisha and to have them speak with us this evening. Each of our speakers will talk for about 10 minutes, sharing their perspectives about the challenges that renters now face. Then they will spend about 15 minutes discussing legislation that we expect will be put forward during the upcoming General Assembly session. While this is going on, we invite you to post questions in the chat. We'll share them with the speakers during the Q&A period after their formal remarks. And in the last 5 minutes, JUFJ staff will tell you about the next steps in our advocacy work. And we'll start with Zephyr.
Thank you. Everybody, I appreciate this opportunity to talk to you on this important evening, the series of evenings for the Heschel experience. My name is Zephyr. I'm an attorney at the Public Justice Center, as was said, and I hope I'm a familiar face. I want to kind of just jump into this and talk about what the experience of the pandemic has been like in the rental market, specifically with renters. But I want to say, if you're a landlord on this Zoom tonight, please take a deep breath. No one's out to criticize you. I fully acknowledge, I think many renter advocates do, that this has been an extremely stressful time during the COVID-19 crisis for providers of housing. And that said, I do want to just start out with a statistic, if you'll indulge me, from a science journal article that came out in this month from the University of Pennsylvania, a modeling based on demographics in Philadelphia was able to show that a correlation of for every 60 evictions during the pandemic, there being a correlation to one death. And so we're really talking about not just an economic squeeze or frustration over when money is going to come into someone's account, but we're really talking about life and death. And eviction can be a death sentence. Let's talk about what's been going on, because I'm sure you've heard a lot of things depending on where you live in Maryland. But as a matter of fact, there is no statewide eviction moratorium in Maryland. And there hasn't been. There's been court closures that have been guided by whether the Court of Appeals thought that it was safe to have people in their court buildings working and conducting business. It wasn't really about whether it was safe to evict someone or not. The governor, Hogan, had an executive order in April, continues to this day, which said that during this crisis, tenants should be able to come to court and prove by evidence that they have a substantial loss of income related to COVID-19. And if they're able to prove it, a judge should not enter judgment, which the courts then construed as meaning there can be a trial, a fact finding, a ruling, basically the kit and caboodle, except that judgment would be reserved until the day after the state of emergency is rescinded. The CDC order that you may have heard about is being treated much the same way. In fact, tenants have to come to court and prove 5 different elements to prove their eligibility for the CDC protection, which itself expires on December 31st. And so many judgments that have been entered over the past 10 weeks since the pay-to-pay rent docket opened, because the courts believed it was safe to have that many people in the court buildings. That protection for those tenants, if they were eligible, ends and judgment will be automatically entered thereafter in January. If you thought about whether leases could be renewed, well, there's no protection against them not being renewed, and there is no statewide protection against rent increases, although jurisdictions have in different parts of the state enacted protections against rent increase as well as late fees during the pandemic. So where we're at right now, the U.S. Census Household Pulse Survey data from the end of September showed that there were approximately 200,000 renter households in Maryland that were facing the inability to pay rent or the threat of eviction. And that was actually down from earlier in the mid-summer time when that number exceeded 200,000, was closer to 300,000. But the majority of that many households during the summer were the moderate and low income households, which numbered approximately 200,000. So we're seeing sort of a concentration in the problem. It's scaling down, but it's concentrating among low-income renters, just as you would think it would. And the projected rent shortfall by January 2021 is around $400 million or more dollars. The governor's rental assistance really wasn't up to the task. There was an estimate at the beginning of the pandemic that we needed around $1 billion of rental assistance for the entire year. 20 million is, of course, an important amount of money. It's not sufficient to cover what renting households need right now, particularly with the end of federal unemployment benefits. How has this all played out in court? I want to tell you that the week that court reopened, I had a client, a woman in her early 60s, someone battling cancer. She had not been served notice of her eviction. This is fairly common in our system, in which we have hundreds of thousands of cases a year. Literally, 2019, we had 680,000 cases filed. she had paid amounts of money after a judgment had been entered in her absence, and then found that she was being evicted despite her making payments. And we acted immediately to get her into court, with the sheriff across from us at the district court in Baltimore City. And we invoked the CDC order. We said that she had been making payments. She had been trying to get assistance through the Cancer Society. The sheriff and the landlord were able to show that there's some documents that she had gotten notice of an eviction and some text messages in which she acknowledged that she had gotten notice, although she was testifying to the judge that she hadn't known about the eviction. Well, it turned out that in the text message, she was confused. She'd been talking about some other case because landlords can file as many cases as they need to during this pandemic. And so she had multiple eviction cases and she was confused. And the court ruled that because of her confusion, which the court interpreted as lack of credibility, the court couldn't give credence to her declarations under the CDC declaration, essentially required to invoke the CDC orders protections. And so she was ordered evicted that day. And she's someone who had an attorney. And so you need to imagine that despite whatever protections you've heard about and that I've just talked to you about, there are thousands of people struggling through this system if they even know to show up. There's a massive state of confusion throughout the courts right now. When tenants show up, some believe they don't owe rent because of the governor's order. Some believe that it's illegal to evict someone because of some such order. And so, these are all factors in our advocacy and trying to bring not just clarity to people's rights, but using this opportunity right now when there's so much focus on this system to really help legislators and other policymakers identify how are we going to fix this and build it, and to use the term that all the Democrats are using, build it back better. You can't just return to normal. Because in normal times, as Public Justice Center showed in our 2015 report, Justice Diverted, which one of our partners on was Jews United for Justice, 8% of renters succeed in actually raising their defenses in front of the court. And the other 90+% are just winding up making bad deals or walking away from the court not knowing how to raise a defense. So it's even more important now to get to the structural reforms and use the attention that people, sort of the wake up call that people have been hearing to make what Jews United for Justice and Public Justice Center and Renters United Maryland have been advocating for a number of years. And we'll talk about that after Tisha shares her part of the presentation.
Okay, Tisha, we'll hear from Tisha now.
Okay, there we go. Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, sorry. Okay, thank you all for this opportunity this evening. The first slide you see right here, it just encapsulates the relationship between tenants and landlords or property owners, the struggles that renters experience, not just as renters per se, but in their daily lives, and how it culminates especially considering the power and that balance exists between landlords, property owners, and renters. You know, the power imbalance, I think, as Zuffer kind of indicated, it is really baked into is baked into the apple pie of this country. And I'll get into that a little bit later. So some of my organizing initiatives are listed here. I am actually the co-founder and the treasurer for the Bolton House Residents Association. I live in Bolton House Apartments, which is right in the State Center area. It's slated to undergo a big redevelopment. So it's basically a precursor to what we see as our inevitable demise and lack of another source of affordable housing in Baltimore. Because the property management company here, which is Edgewood Property Management, has so many properties in Baltimore, and the residents experience very similar living conditions, we and the organization, which is the Edgewood Residents Coalition. And as you know, I'm also a member of Baltimore Renters United. I just give you a little bit of background on me and how I got started with organizing around housing. I experienced several medical and health obstacles, and as a result, ended up having various surgeries. I'm actually partially blind and was out of work for quite a while. I was, I guess, fortunate enough to secure an apartment while I waited for a housing choice voucher. I waited for 5 years, which to some sounds like an extreme amount of time. But if you know anything about this program in Baltimore, which is actually now closed, the waiting list is closed. There are people who've waited for 10 or 15 years to receive a housing choice voucher. After I received the voucher, I looked for an apartment literally for 18 months because no one wanted to take my voucher. Those who were willing to take my voucher, the dwellings were, in my eyes, uninhabitable. They were horrible. And that was actually a precursor or one of the catalysts to me getting involved in the Maryland Home Act, actually last legislative session. So it is very humbling, but it's also very telling that it took me 5 years to actually acquire the voucher, and then another 1.5 years to find somewhere that would use it. Once I found a landlord that would take my voucher, he basically denied me my rights to have reasonable accommodations. The apartment had no overhead lighting and no central heat. He made promise after promise to address these issues, and to no avail. So I ended up leaving and moving into my current residency. I will not go through the litany list of issues that we deal with. Suffice it to say, they are actually public health concerns. And they're concerns that cross the board of issues that residents deal with, not only at Edgewood Properties, but in buildings, in housing units or housing apartment complexes across Baltimore. So this is kind of my little description of how I see Baltimore. You know, the truth about Baltimore, renters are the majority minority. About 54% of occupied units in Baltimore are rented. And about 30% of renters, 30% of renters are rent burdened, which means they pay more than 30% of their income toward housing. And you know, I mentioned that because it really is one of the biggest issues that renters deal with in Baltimore and really nationwide. And I put that, you know, post-pandemic and in current times. Of course, the times we're dealing with right now are excruciating, but I want people to really understand that the issues, and these are not just personal problems, but these are issues that renters deal with in Baltimore have been ongoing, have been ongoing for years. And this pandemic has just exacerbated them. And what we're trying to do now is, again, to highlight the fact that these are not personal problems, but they are issues that span demographics. Again, later on, I'll talk about how racial, ethnic diversity, and really neighborhood diversity has been used as a way to kind of cloud the issue and keep us from organizing and really galvanizing our power. So, like I said, what is becoming clear is that all over the city, for far too long, renters have been dealing with, on their own, problems that are really issues. And so we're trying to take this opportunity now, though we're dealing with a digital divide, we're not able to meet in person, but we're really trying to galvanize, scale this initiative. With tenants from management and other tenants. And one of the things I've experienced here is that retaliation against management is reason enough. That right there is reason enough to halt any efforts for people you know, filing complaints with the management company, filing complaints with HABC or any office or department that really is to oversee the management of properties and to afford tenants to ensure that their rights are not being violated. And the covert and overt ways that tenants are retaliated against, such as, you know, all of a sudden you don't have any hot water, or all of a sudden the heat is not working. Work orders that you put in are ignored. It affects not only your standard of living, but it creates anxiety. It compromises your mental health. And the other component, being retaliated against by your own neighbors. oftentimes you may be dealing with issues of crime within your building, and bringing attention to that really does, it shakes the status quo of the culture in your building, and those who may be comfortable with it, now you are a target. And this is, it's really no way to live. Issues, again, violation of your rights by your landlord, imbalance of power dynamics. I mentioned the criminal activity. Again, one thing that I mentioned before, that a lot, especially people who rent, who I qualify, we're dealing with resource instability, or low income individuals. The properties are poorly managed. The infrastructure is shoddy. Here in this building, we deal with plumbing issues almost every week. At some point during the week, the water is turned off to deal with a plumbing issue. Elevators are not working. We currently don't have heat. So these are issues that persist. We can all deal with, and we can all accept emergencies and isolated incidents, but when it's a constant occurrence, then these are issues. And lack of affordable options. Again, this is something that people deal with around the country, across the country. There is no state, there's not one state in the union that has enough affordable housing for the citizens who need it. So it's one or the other. Either we address the income disparities, we address the fact that people are working full time and still can't afford, their wages don't cover the rent, or we make some kind of accommodations and put a halt on the increase of what a dwelling. There's been an imbalance for far too long. The price, the inflation of housing definitely has been out of proportion to wages and the living that people are afforded. And this quote right here, it really does speak to the inequities. The weary seeking, I'm weary seeing the laboring classes so wretchedly housed, fed, clothed, while thousands of dollars are spent on unsightly statues. If those great men must have outdoor memorials, let them be in the form of handsome blocks of buildings for the poor. It speaks volumes that this quote is from 1886, and we're still dealing with the very same issues. The fact that our country has not deemed it urgent enough to imagine a society where everyone is worthy of housing. But again, we're talking about a country, and these are just facts, a country where your value and your power is based upon you being a landowner. So we really need to keep those things in perspective. And again, we talk about the imbalance of power and how it does affect it affects the country, it affects the pulse of a country. This director of the health department in Baltimore County says that housing should be deemed a vital sign. When you're talking to your patients, after you take their blood pressure and take their other vital signs, you need to be asking them about their housing stability, because it is definitely an indicator of health. And that is a microcosm, that's a microcosm of the macro health of a society. And get to that point and this recognizing that. So barriers to organizing, some I think are very general, and I think others are very specific to Baltimore. Baltimore's legendary number of neighborhoods. Another organizer's name is Terrence Yu. He coined this phrase, invisible fences. And a lot of people, Baltimore has a lot of charm, and a lot of its charm is informed by the vast number of neighborhoods we have. But there's also a downside to that, because we become very colloquial within our little neighborhoods. And what goes on the east side, we deem different from what goes on the west side and in South Baltimore as opposed to North Baltimore. And it's absolutely false. You know, when we start talking across these invisible fences, we realize that if you're a renter in Baltimore, you're probably dealing with some very similar issues. So, you know, just breaking down those invisible fences or being able to talk across them, that is definitely something that we've been trying to do for a while now. The racially divisive narrative, you know, this is something that we deal with, again, with attacking various social justice issues. I'm a part of the Poor People's Campaign as well. Talk about this, looking at it doesn't matter if you're Latinx. It doesn't matter if you're African American when it comes to being a renter in again, something to move on. We have the fear of retaliation. We mentioned this earlier. The reality that a lot of people, you know, myself included, who do this work or are impacted by this work, the people we seek to engage in this organizing effort, they lead busy lives. The administrative assistance, because it takes a lot of time. It's very, very time costly. You know, if you need resources or assistance, it's even more costly to your time. So if you're a 27-year-old mother of two and you have a full-time job, and like most Baltimore residents, you don't have a car and you're depending on public transportation, you don't have a whole lot of time to devote to organizing. So it's definitely a barrier. The digital divide, which is real. And everything is on Zoom, a virtual platform. Organizing renters is new in Baltimore. So we don't really have that much, we don't have many models, we don't have many points of reference. So that's definitely a barrier. Lack of resources, space in which to organize. These things take money, outreach takes money. And being transient. You know, Zafar was talking about, eviction destabilizes, being part of the community. Which unfortunately a lot of residents, you don't have the opportunity to build trust, and organizing really does, it requires, and really not being aware of your right to organize is a definite barrier. And here we talk about the landlord-tenant imbalance, the power imbalance. And I just list, some of the ways that this, how the scales are imbalanced as far as who holds the power. I was listening to something the other day, and renters are required oftentimes to prove their rental history, and landlords don't have to do that. So it may sound a little unconventional, but that really is an imbalance of power, because property owners or property management companies need oversight. They need to be held accountable. And unfortunately, some of these structures that exist that are supposedly holding them accountable for it. And you end up with a city that allows management companies who are poor actors, who are bad actors, to become dominant. And renters have nowhere else to go. They have no recourse. And that is real. We talk about, and of course, school to prison pipeline, and also an evicted homeless prisoner pipeline. We still deal with the criminalization of homelessness, and it is very how to find housing, be evicted. Oftentimes, eviction does lead to homelessness, and and in the society. And then I mentioned I'm a part of the Baltimore Poor People's Campaign, a call, and just sitting with the reality that we live in a country that has allowed a segment of the population to be deemed homeless, and we are fighting homelessness. The semantics are real. We need to be fighting poverty and not the poor. We need to be fighting homelessness and stop calling people homeless. They experience homelessness. People are evicted. They are not the evicted. So semantics are real.
Tisha,
Yes.
it's Anna. Your internet is cutting in and out. I wonder if we could.
Yes, that was actually the end of I just had this last slide.
Oh, okay, awesome.
Yeah. No, it's
because this has been so impactful. So
yes.
thank you.
Yes, no, thank you all. Thank you so much. And, you know, I really do. I've been working with Zuffer for maybe the last year or so. And the work that he does is, I guess the word is impactful. And I've had the ability to learn from the work that he does and the data that he pulls together. But I'm just hoping that, you know, my part of the effort bring the like myself who deal with this issue on a daily basis to the table so that we can sit side by side and do our part together. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
In the remaining time, I think it would make sense, Zephyr, if you could summarize the legislative action that we're anticipating in the General Assembly this coming session.
Sure. Okay, let me put this in my slide format here. Okay. I just want to thank Tisha for that presentation and really just echo that the power imbalance, you know, the fear of retaliation, the decrepit housing conditions, the power imbalance in the bargain of a contract, you know, that exists in Baltimore, that exists in Dundalk, it exists in Hagerstown, in Langdon Park. So that imbalance is all around our region. And we're in a position right now to really shine that level of light across the state on the issues, many of which Tisha just spoke to. But at the same time, we are working within the constraints of the legislative process, and all of that it brings, and as well as COVID-19, which threatens to really constrain our advocacy virtually, but even in terms of the length of the session that's impending. And so we're looking at really two types of priorities for legislative advocacy. We have to address the COVID-19 crisis, because we can't for another year leave it up to Governor Hogan to decide whose rights matter. And at the same time, we need to use this moment to continue to advocate for structural reforms. Not every one of those reforms even grazes the types of structural levels of disempowerment that many renters face in Maryland that Tisha just talked about. But we're continuing a long campaign here of focusing on mitigating the harm that our court process, our judicial process, actually could, and many times does, inflict on the working poor. So let me start talking about what the emergency response is. And we're really working hand in hand here with leaders like Janelle Wilkins, Delegate Janelle Wilkins, Delegate Vaughn Stewart, to make sure that there's a recovery protection that lasts not just in 2021, but through the next session in April 2022. And this would cover really the basics of what we were talking about throughout the pandemic so far, expanding the protections that the governor's order and the CDC order have provided, and making sure that there's no loopholes, for instance, for lease termination. So this would provide much of what the governor himself has talked about as being a protection for tenants, but also including, for instance, a requirement that there's, or a prohibition, I should say, against evictions where there's no good cause. And so we're talking about protecting tenants from non-renewal of their lease during this pandemic. And practitioners will tell you that's on the rise as landlords can't get their rent-based, their non-payment based evictions into court fast enough. they're simply non-renewing leases, many of which are month to month or coming to expire at the end of the year. And they currently under law don't have to state a reason for that non-renewal. This emergency provision would require that. And of course, it has a sunset provision in it at the end of April 2022. We need to create a rental assistance program because we don't have a statewide uniform rental assistance apparatus at this point. Governor Hogan wanted this to devolve to the localities. They'll decide. And what we have is people in Glen Burnie, for instance, are being treated differently than people in Ellicott City. And we need to have some uniformity there and make sure that whatever funds the state might get from a Biden administration are being used in a way where there are levers for fairness against eviction, against debt collection, and really favoring housing stability. There are a number of other provisions I've listed here that you've heard about, and depending on where you live, prohibiting late fees, capping rent increases, doing this at a statewide level. And also what I mean by in point 3 here, prohibiting the foreclosure right to pay and stay means there are so many rent cases being serially filed, one action for August, one action for September, and so on, that by the time we get to 2021, many tenants are going to have so many judgments that they no longer under law have the right to continue paying to redeem possession. That right to pay and stay is the right of redemption after a judgment for possession was entered in a failure to pay rent case. So we're talking about prohibiting that. We need to reduce harm that's going to occur from this pandemic. We know that, just like I was saying, with all of the litigation that's happening, that leaves a record that's going to be hard for tenants to overcome when they're trying to recover out of this emergency. So we're talking about creating for the first time in Maryland constraints on what can be used in the tenant screening process to deny a tenant's application for new housing. We're talking about restricting reporting of certain types of information to credit bureaus. And probably the most significant here, creating for the first time a mechanism to shield eviction records. And we've talked to legislators about these provisions. There's likely to be 3 different bills for each of these 3 things, but they all really go to one point, which is, and I'm talking about the housing package. This is really part 4 of the housing package to reduce harm that's occurring from all the litigation. But the other big 2 parts of this housing package, and again, like the first was the emergency response that I talked about, and bookended by the harm reduction part. But let's get into the middle part here. And that's the structural reforms that really touched on everything that Tisha and I have talked about so far. We need to create the fair court process so that if someone does have, for instance, no heat during a pandemic, but they're way behind on rent because of the pandemic, that they're actually going to have a fair process to litigate this issue if and when they're in front of a judge. And so we've come up with a bill that brings diversion from eviction and defense to eviction together in a really threaded together very tightly in a reform bill. Create a prerequisite or precondition to filing these cases so that if you are behind on rent as a renter and you're trying to get rental assistance from your county and you're just in that process, it's a lot of red tape, but the landlord's going to court, that lawsuit by the landlord would essentially be invalid because they haven't exhausted what are the available steps for rental assistance or mediating a negotiated payment plan. That would be the first hurdle to even filing a case. Once you get into a court case, after that step, we're talking about creating a more structured, formal eviction diversion process where it's actually the court itself that is facilitating the triage of litigants to rental assistance, to social services, to housing counseling, to mediation, that it would all happen at court, setting up eviction diversion programs at each of the highest volume courts, district courts throughout the state.
Zephyr,
Zephyr,
Yes.
I know we've been running a bit late, and I'm noticing we're close to the 7 o'clock hour. So I apologize for having to cut you short, but I think we're going to have to close this portion of the evening's program. And I want to thank you for all that you've presented, and even more so for all the work you've been doing for years. And, you know, we truly appreciate you as a leading partner in the coalition, and absolutely we've benefited from your knowledge, and I know we're going to continue to benefit from all the work you've been doing. So thank you. And again, thank you to Tisha for your moving story, and which was also quite informative. So,
My
and,
pleasure.
thanks to all the participants who've tuned in to listen to your stories and learn the information that you've had to share with us, both of you. So thanks again.
thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to Zephyr and Tisha.
Yep, and I'll just say on behalf of JFJ, we're really looking forward to working with both of you as we head into the next legislative session. And for folks who are tuned in, this is absolutely not your last opportunity to hear from them and to join in this advocacy. So clearly there's a lot of work to be done, and we hope that you're going to be involved with us. We'll be able to share around resources with you all, including a feedback form, but also links so you can learn more about the work that's being done by all of the amazing organizations involved in this work. And so I really encourage you to check that out and to keep an ear out for future events where we'll get to hear from Tisha and from Zephyr and continue to learn together. So I think Molly might be throwing some links in the chat, but otherwise definitely we'll be following up via email so everyone gets all of that information. It's also, just so you all know, there's another program happening starting just in a few minutes. So we hope you'll stick around, jump back into the main room and be able to be plugged in for some education around police accountability and reform in Maryland. So unless I am missing anything, Laura or Molly, I think we'll say we'll see you in the main room. And again, huge thank you to Zephyr and to Tisha.